So, Agnes, it is wonderful to see you today. And I'm really delighted to have this conversation with you about your career, your development, life, love, money, work, all those good things. So, let me introduce you a little bit with my first question, because I know that your first career was in the international development and not-for-profit world, and you worked on social justice and climate change. However, you transitioned, and today you work mainly as a therapist and trainer, supporting those who, like yourself back then, work on social and environmental issues and end up feeling stuck, burned out, and in despair. So that was a bit of an introduction into your field of work already, and I would love to know more about your path and how you ended up doing what you're doing today.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. So yeah, my path was that I thought that I knew very, very early on what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I was about, I think, 14, 15, 16 when I discovered the world of international collaboration, cooperation, international development, started volunteering in different places and felt completely impassionated by this and was really keen to make a difference in the world. And the best way that I thought I knew at the time to do that was to enter that field of international development. And it was very exciting. It was, it allowed me to travel and to be in different cultures, to learn and speak different languages, to meet people from all over the world, to go to places that I probably wouldn't have ever had the chance to visit if it wasn't for this. And it was certainly a great learning experience. And I think what was behind that was a real sense of injustice in the world, seeing the differences between the living standards in different countries, seeing inequality, seeing the impacts of natural disasters affecting different countries in such hugely different ways. I remember being really struck by what happens when there's an earthquake in California versus what happens when there's an earthquake in a place like Armenia or Turkey or Haiti, for example, later on. And at the time, finding that the best way to address these inequalities was to go to the kind of the impact side of it. So go to the places where people were living in poverty, were experiencing the impacts of these disasters and of the economic inequalities. And to begin with, that went really well. It was interesting. And at the time I was doing that, climate change kind of started to come onto the agenda in international development. People started to become more aware that there was, in terms of natural disasters and impact on food security and on poverty and so on, there was a huge kind of another huge disaster coming and already unfolding. And so I got really curious about the ways in which people in different countries could adapt to these changes. And I became a quote unquote expert in climate change adaptation in the developing world, and spent a lot of time kind of going backwards and forwards between the places where we were working on the projects on the ground, but also in the places where funding and policy decisions were being made about how the very, very scarce resources we had for this work were going to be spent. And for a while, it went really well, but after a while, I also started feeling really uncomfortable in this work. And in the very beginning, when I first noticed this discomfort, I wasn't really able to put a finger on what exactly is going on with that. I just noticed that I wasn't quite feeling myself in my integrity, and something felt kind of off. And it took a bit of time to explore and to find out what was going on. And over time, I gradually realized that there were, apart from the fact there was a huge sense of disillusionment about the lack of actual change in the world, it was also that it gradually dawned on me that the ways that I was approaching it were perhaps more to do with propping up a system that is part of the problem than with actually attacking these issues by their root causes. And the ways I was noticing that were in kind of small details to begin with, in small interactions with people in different countries, and in ways that things just felt quite fraught and felt a bit disingenuous perhaps for me. And so over time, I began to burn out, I think. That's probably the best description of what happened to me. It was partly because of the amount of work I was doing and the amount of time I was spending on the road, and how difficult it was to have any sense of any kind of a balanced life. But also it was, I think more importantly, it was a burnout from a sort of meaning perspective. My work began to feel meaningless, and I'd spent a lot of time in places where decisions were being made or not made about climate change, in the United Nations Climate Change Convention conferences, for example, and just seeing the kind of the immense effort poured into those conferences and how little actually happens at the end of the day, and how little progress is actually there, and how often the corporate interest and the short-term interest does win over the long-term solutions. So there was a crisis of meaning from that perspective, but there was also this kind of gnawing sense that I was actually part of the problem. And that's where I began to kind of shift into or towards the work that I do now, because I became very interested in what's actually going on inside me and what's going on inside the people who are doing this work. Why do we end up in jobs and in roles where we are out there trying to save the world? And what are the unintended consequences, and what is the accidental harm that we sometimes do with that?
I think that is a fascinating angle to look at aid work globally, and one that is definitely not done half often enough. And I believe part of your sort of awakening journey, as I understood it, was also in 2015 or so. You met Peter Koenig for the first time and were introduced to money work and his particular angle of reclamation work. Can you say a bit more on how that affected your path?
Yes, absolutely. So that was, yes, it was 2014-15 when I first met him. And at the time, it kind of snuck into my life, this work, because I was leaving my job. So I decided to quit my career in international development in 2014, and I left in early 2015. So I kind of, as my partner Tom would say, I threw my hat over the wall. I made a decision without a plan, and it felt like a huge risk to just quit my job without knowing what exactly was happening next. So obviously I was concerned about income, and I was burning through my savings very quickly. And I had this idea that I was going to, maybe travel for 3 months and be in different countries and have some kind of epiphany, and then come back and hit the ground running with my new plan, and it was all going to go as well as my first career. And it didn't quite work like that. That what followed was a very messy, drawn out, long unraveling process. But at the beginning of this unraveling process, I came across Peter and the money work. And I was interested in it partially because I was very concerned about money. I was very concerned about my own financial stability. I was worried that I was going to get to the end of my savings without a new job. But I was also curious about my identity as somebody whose identity and whose sense of pride and strength was very pegged to being someone independent financially and otherwise, being someone who is helping others, who has a kind of a manifest purpose in the world. And overnight, that kind of went. My income and also this clear purpose went, and I had a full-blown identity crisis. And when I first met Peter and started to explore the money work, I very quickly understood that this isn't just about money, but it's actually about who I am, or who I see myself as, and how restricted that can be, and how that restricts me in my life, and how that restricts relationships with people and systems as well. And so I began to explore both what it means to come to terms with my, for example, financial dependence on someone else. So going from being independent to dependent financially speaking, but I also began to explore what it means to be selfish, to be someone who isn't helping other people, someone who doesn't have a clear purpose right now. And Peter's work somehow enabled me to get some sense of enjoyment and of excitement out of that, rather than it just feeling like a threat. So it was a very stressful time. And through his approach to looking at money and looking at our sense of self and identity, I could feel something opening up in me and something getting very excited in me as well. I could really sense, and this is when I speak this, it's very embodied. I can really feel that in my body. I could get a sense of real opportunity and excitement and connection with something.
Right. All right. And we'll get back to the topic of body in a moment. For now, I'd be interested to hear a bit more about how this work around money has also affected your view of the work that aid workers do in the world, that the work that NGOs do in the world, and how much you feel that is effectual or not, and what do you think would need to change to really create the impact that people are striving for, particularly who come with this intention of wanting to do something better, of wanting to do good.
Mm-hmm. I think what's critical here is the idea of the shadow, from Carl Jung. This idea that there are parts of ourselves that are part of our kind of conscious self that we want to be and want to see in the world, and then there are parts of us that we'd rather sweep under the rug and not see, and they're often unconscious. And for me the value of taking Peter's approach into this kind of system of international development is that I think when I look at it now, I wasn't seeing it at the time through that lens, but when I look at it now, I can understand that what I was experiencing and witnessing and part of was the shadow of the international development world expressing itself. So what I mean by that is you have a bunch of people whose identity and manifest purpose it is to do good in the world, to be helpful, to be altruistic, to be rescuers, to be heroes. And all of those opposites of that, the selfishness, the greed, the neediness, all of those parts that we weren't trying to be, were still coming up. That's what happens with shadow is whether or not you choose to be that thing, it's there and it's going to manifest itself in some way. And when it's unconscious, it's out of control. And so those were the things that I was experiencing in the international development world, that the unconscious selfishness, the unconscious victimhood, the unconscious greed, all of those pieces were being acted out in some way. And that by taking a more holistic view of ourselves as individuals, as people, but also as organizations, we could come to a more, I would say, honest engagement with what we are doing, what we're here for, and what the impact is.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And it makes a lot of sense, because in some ways one could say that the unconscious helper inadvertently becomes a co-creator of sort of a capitalistic a system that they actually would like to on some level dismantle, but they keep feeding the same beast, right? And that's what you discussed earlier.
I think that's a really good example, because when your identity is pegged to being helpful, then in a way it's dependent on being helpful. And then so someone who depends on being helpful also depends on the needy. And it creates this vested interest in keeping, and I'm not saying this is conscious, this is often unconscious, but being very invested in being helpful creates an unconscious need for a needy person, or a helpee, so to speak, and an unconscious vested interest in keeping that power relationship intact. And the international development industry, sort of by its very kind of raison d'etre, depends on certain power relationships, which happen in this case to be colonial power relationships that still exist to this day. It has the international development industry has colonialism in its DNA, so to speak. And I've talked to people before about how it feels like it's like a zombie. It's still alive. We thought it died in the 1960s when countries started going independent. But actually it's still very much alive and kicking, and that expresses itself in geopolitics and in the international corporation world as well.
No, I find that absolutely fascinating, how we keep things alive that we don't even believe in a conscious way. But that's why what you said earlier is so important, that the unconscious becomes conscious, so that we can look at what we're doing, in fact, instead of being stuck in it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it brings me also back to the other question that we wanted to continue working with, to the body, right? Because I do think there's something about this process of consciousness that has a lot to do with the body. And I know that you are, a great believer in the power of the body in taking the, in particular, the autonomic nervous system that every one of us consists of as a key partner in social change. And I would be fascinated to hear your perspective of what has the nervous system, what has our body to do with social change?
Yeah, I think it has everything to do with social change, because the way our bodies are programmed, well, program sounds very clinical, but we are in a way made for seeking and wanting certain things in the world around us. And there is some kind of innate programming in us that gets acted out as well in global cooperation and in organizations and in our relationships with people. But kind of I want to zoom out here first a little bit with this question, because I think for me what this comes down to is there's someone called Charles Eisenstein who has thought a lot about various things, including the global economy, including climate change and global cooperation. And he talks about a very important kind of narrative that we live by collectively, or that we have been living by collectively, that he calls the story of separateness, or the story of separation. But according to the story of separateness, there's this like very, Newtonian materialistic worldview that we've all been educated into, I think. And I certainly was someone who really approached the world through my head to begin with. In my first career, in my 20s, everything was here. I was completely out of contact with my body. And I think that's what a lot of our education has encouraged us to do as well. But it leads to this kind of splitting of the world into disparate, separate parts. And in the context of my work, for example, at the time, some of these parts were things like this drama triangle that's often used in coaching, where you have a victim and a perpetrator and a rescuer. So I was seeing the world through the lens of these different parts, and I was seeing myself in a rescuer role, obviously, and victims in living in poverty, and perpetrators in the form of corporate interests, the private sector, certain governments, and so on. So there were these very clear lines drawn. And this kind of social change mentality of seeing everything as separate parts ignores how everything is actually interlinked, and how each individual part is also a reflection of the whole. So that was a major shift for me in my understanding of social change, is that the link between the inner change, my personal development, and the global change is that what happens in me reflects the whole. And also I'm a reflection of the whole. I'm a reflection of the system. And Charles Eisenstein encourages us to think about moving towards a story of interbeing and of interconnection, where we are all parts of that whole. We are all part of the function, of the dysfunction. We're all part of the beauty as well, of the whole system. And what this is to do with our nervous systems, I know this can feel a bit like a stretch, is that we have, in our autonomic nervous system, by and large, we have two basic ways of functioning, two basic kind of ways of modes of being, depending on how safe or how unsafe we feel. Because the autonomic nervous system's primary purpose is to keep us safe and keep us alive and able to reproduce and so on, like all of these kind of basic bodily needs that we have as part of not just human evolution, but natural evolution on the planet. We want to stay alive, and we want to procreate, and we want to kind of keep the species and the system living somehow. And we have these two basic ways of functioning, where one is I am defending myself and I'm trying to stay safe in the face of danger. And the other is I am connected to everything around me, and I'm engaging with the world around me. And again, what you could call the safety brain, or the defensive part, is all about physically being regulated in such a way that I can perform really well to either fight a danger, to run away, or to kind of pretend I'm dead. to freeze. These are all these different kind of survival responses we have. There's more to that, but those are the basic ones. If I'm in my connected brain where I'm feeling safe, if I'm in the connected mode of my nervous system, I have more receptiveness. I have a better ability to connect with the world around me. I'm more playful, and I have a way of seeing myself as part of something greater than myself. And so by definition, in that mode, I'm in a way a more advanced human being, or I'm a more conscious human being than I am when I'm in my survival mode.
Yeah.
And so much of what's happening in the world right now is pushing us into survival mode. And for me, what Peter Koenig's work does, what the projection reclamation work does, it gives me a tool for expanding my capacity to be in a safer place within myself, so that I can be more connected, more receptive. I have access to the more evolved features of my physiology, of my brain. I have access to my to this part of the prefrontal cortex, which can think about the future, which can take perspective, which can put myself in someone else's shoes, which co-regulates in a very effective way with my environment. And that is, for me, the beauty of this work in terms of the nervous system, but also, and I'm not a neuroscientist, I should say as well, I have some ideas or hypotheses about how this might work, but from my experience, even though in this work, in projection reclamation work and in money work, we use language, where the rubber hits the road is in the body and in the nervous system. That's where the change happens. The language is just a way to access that.
Absolutely. My experience, very, very similar, right? And in some ways, I think that's where the understanding of connectedness begins to unfold in each and every one of us, realizing that my language, acts of language, are also not disconnected from me. They are me, and they're part of my body. They're an expression of my body, and they are in resonance with me, and they're in resonance with you, right? And that's how language creates ripple effects in my system as well as in your system. And it's a wonderful tool to work with if you can perceive it as more than just a statement. Yeah.
Which again is such a beautiful example of you stepping into an interbeing story rather than a separateness story. And in the story of separateness, we also have this idea of the mind and the body as separate. Whereas I think now we're coming to an understanding in neuroscience as well that it's really impossible to completely separate these two.
Yeah. And I know that, given that you have interest in sort of the neuropsychology behind all of this, not familiar. Are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist's work around the left and the right brain? Right. So that's something that came up for me as well, is that I feel the work that you do, and also with Peter Koenig's money work, creates a capacity to tap into the right brain functions in a very particular way, and left brain, right brain, I know that has been around for since the 80s, and now we're realizing it's actually not off, but it's a bit more complex than what we used to think about. So I'd love to also hear a bit more about your understanding of this development now and how to look at this.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm completely up to speed on the thinking on the left brain and the right brain, but where sort of my personal life story and all of this come together is that I don't think I even thought about any way of knowing other than through my mind and through language until a number of years ago. It was just, that was how knowing happens. That's how understanding happens. It's through the cognitive, quote unquote, rational mind. And there was this juxtaposition between the rational and the irrational. And a lot of our shadow is actually often filled up with all these pieces of ourselves that we consider, culturally, I think as well, this happens, irrational. So whatever our imagination knows, what our body knows, is often, kind of siphoned off into that area because it's considered inferior, an inferior part of our thinking and knowing and being in the world. And increasingly, I'm experiencing these things as interwoven, and coming into my coming into my body more, coming into my imaginal senses more has been part of my therapeutic training a lot. And what was the biggest challenge there for me, and what was the biggest also excitement for me, was this discovery of all these other ways of sensing and knowing and being that aren't just about this one entry point of the quote unquote rational mind. For me, this whole left brain, right brain thing makes me think of a study that I heard about a couple of years ago, where somebody had looked at chess players and what happens inside them when they make decisions about their next moves. And I'm not going to go into loads of detail, but the finding of that study was that our idea that we have a rational mind and emotion as separate kind of falls flat on its face, and that they're completely intertwined, and that even the most, we would probably think of chess players as the closest thing humans can be to an AI. Even chess players make decisions emotively, and not just rationally, because these things aren't that separate. Yeah, and I think, again, we're swimming in this water of the story of separateness, where we've divided the world up in all these particles, which has been really helpful. Understanding of atoms, the understanding of engineering, and so on. But when it comes to understanding, I think, ourselves and the human systems, and also not just human, here's again another separate story of humans and nature. But when it comes to understanding ourselves as part of a living system, we need more than just that lens.
Yeah. Thank you. So actually, let's make it personal for whoever is listening, reading this. If I'm a person who wants to affect change, right? And I don't even care if it's within an organization, that could be a for-profit organization, or within the field of not-for-profit. How do you feel that looking at my relation to money, to identity, doing shadow work, why is that important? And why does it, why do you think I should be investing myself?
I think there are quite a few different parts to that question. And the first one that obviously comes to mind for people is when I'm dealing with my relationship to money, there's something about changing my relationship to money that can be really helpful. And that is, to begin with, about revealing the unconscious stories that are driving my behavior, or the unconscious program that is driving my behavior and my choices in life. And so often I talk to people in the change-making world, whether it's individuals who are pondering whether to switch roles or whether they're in the right job, people who have burnt out or don't find enough meaning in their work anymore and want to make a change. The one thing that often stops them is money, or so they say. It's like, if it's my income, it's my salary, it's my paycheck. If I can't pay for this, and if I can't pay for that, then it all falls apart. And the same happens often collectively, talking to different organizations about the kind of work they really want to be doing versus the work they are doing. That's often about funding and about donors and their priorities, and that kind of being directed. And part of my personal burnout was the sense that we were constantly like kind of changing direction based on where the wind was blowing from in terms of the funding. And there was very little sense of us actually being able to ground ourselves in what are we about, what do we want to do, and what do we think is the way forward. So there's something about uncovering what are the unconscious narratives behind my relationship to money. And what the money work also enables is not just surfacing those narratives, but actually engaging with those narratives and changing those narratives. So there's an increased freedom that can come from that. I'm not saying that all the issues with funding will go away overnight, because we also live under the influence of our collective money stories and system. But when individuals and organizations and teams become more conscious about what's actually in the room when money is being talked about, then that frees up a lot of creative agency. It frees up a lot of behavioral freedom as well, because people suddenly start leaving some kind of straitjackets of identity. And it also can really, in my experience, clarify and improve relationships. I've so often been in conversations with really fired up people who are excited about something. And then the finance person raises their hand and starts talking about budget, and everybody loses energy or conflict arises in the room. So that's what this work is really helpful for.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, I was recently in a room with a lot of people who either have money themselves and now invested in philanthropic efforts, or who are around people with a lot of money, managed family offices, that kind of a thing. And I talked about one of the projection types, that Peter Koenig's work describes, which is the washing machine, right? People who sort of cycle back and forth between, and that's how I described it to them. I said, you're probably either yourself or you have witnessed in others that we are in this space of, we need to save the world, right? And we have all of these amazing ideas how that could be done, and then suddenly some insecurity, some vulnerability is triggered in you, and you flip over to the other side where you say, and what are the numbers? Right. And and if I want to do impact investment, what is the return on investment in that particular field, right? Where greed suddenly bites you in the bum until that is satisfied again, and then you can go back to changing the world. But this constant washing motion actually leads to a situation where money, just as you described, has the power to trump everything else that happens in the room. It trumps purpose, it trumps sustainability, it trumps diversity, it trumps all of these topics that we know are essential right now.
Yeah. And what I find so fascinating about this, especially the social change and not-for-profit world, is that in this context, much more so than others, all of that stuff is in the shadow rather than out in the open. So if you go into a hedge fund, everyone's really obvious and clear about the fact that this is about profit and that that's what's to be maximized. And I'm not saying that that's better. I'm just saying that's how it is. There is other stuff there that will be in the shadow. But in a not-for-profit, it's often this kind of idea that, well, we're not for profit, so we are not about the money. We're all about all the other beautiful stuff. We're about social justice. We're about making change. We're about fairness in the world. And then in the shadow is, but it is about the money, and it cannot be fair. And there are some things that are not changing here and that we're not prepared to change. And there is so much taboo around these qualities or these realities in those relationships. And I think that makes the money work particularly juicy in that context, is that there's so much shadow there around money, because we're not about the money. This is not our thing. We're about social change. And bringing that into that context can be much more uncomfortable than in some other contexts, in a for-profit, in a private sector organization who have money as part of their agenda very openly, or profit, Yeah,
no, same experience here. It's quite fascinating how it's easier to bring it up because they talk about money anyway and are aware that it matters to them, even if they haven't understood yet why.
yeah.
Whereas in the not-for-profit, it's just not talked about, right? It's sort of a boo-boo subject. You don't go there. Right?
Yeah, and there are people in those, there tend to be people in those organizations who do talk about it, people who are sitting in the finance departments and people who are dealing with marketing. And then you often have the others who are dealing with the content and the programming. And I'm talking about larger organizations, I think, because in some smaller ones, this will be much more mixed. But my experience is that, and I was in the program side, we didn't want to talk about money. We didn't want to hear about money. Money was a total inconvenience. And as soon as we had to engage with that, things became very fraught. And this also leads to, it created conflict and different agendas in terms of different teams having a different focus. But it also created this strange split, again, another separateness, where the motivation, the meaning, the purpose was separated from the money.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like you can only have one or the other.
Exactly. And it's that unconscious swing, right? And I guess that sort of brings me to my concluding question around, when you look at a collective, right, whether that's an organization or an NGO or foundation, why do you, or in which ways do you feel could a collective benefit from looking at money, and what shape could that take?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of how they could benefit, there's something I kind of want to say about cleaning up our act. There's something about the benefit there, I think, is to step into a space of greater integrity. So one example that comes to mind of many is that I worked in an organization that was all about women's rights and gender equality, on the outside. And on the inside, we had people, if I'd got pregnant while I was still working for that organization, there wouldn't have been a dime of support. And those kinds of shadows, there's something internal, but there's also something about, for example, unconsciously acting out colonialism and so on. So if you're serious about social change, social justice, about integrity with your values, then you have to look at your shadow, because otherwise it's going to just be acting out in this unconscious way, and it's going to rear its ugly head in all these places. And I'm thinking of the Oxfam scandal a few years ago, where all these organizations suddenly had the headlights on them, and all this abuse and kind of all this corrupted abuse was emerging. This is all part of the shadow. So I think one of the benefits of this work is that it's about integrity, and it's about an honest, unflinching look at ourselves, to really examine where the shadow might be and what harm that might be causing. And there's also something about bringing that separated money and purpose piece back together, so that money and purpose can flow together again, so that we can feel like we're in our flow rather than in this experience of feeling blocked. So many change makers feel completely blocked by the concept and the economic realities and the restrictions of money. And what the money work does is it brings more energy and flow back into that, and it kind of pulls everything back together again. But then outside of money, there's also this question of identity. And one of the pieces I was going to give in answer to the earlier question as well, in addition to the money work, is that often in organizations that are all about helping others and making a difference, people end up in these kind of identity straitjackets. And Ram Dass and Paul Gorman call it the helping prison. When you're very identified, for example, it could be something like a doctor, and you're very identified with the role of being the helper and the rescuer. And then again, you're always facing that person who is the needy one and the victim one. It kind of dehumanizes both of you, and it limits both of you in your interaction, and it creates a very specific power relationship. And I know a lot of organizations that want to step away from a colonial way of purposefully or accidentally working in the world. They want more solidarity and more standing shoulder by shoulder with people and seeing eye to eye. And the money work is a way of rehumanizing these relationships, I think. So it's a way of really reconnecting something that has been separated.
I think, Agnes, that's a beautiful sort of conclusion of our conversation today. However, I want to give you the chance, if there's anything that you feel you would still like to add to make this complete for you, then this would be the moment.
Okay. Well, I'm just aware of part B of your question, which was what might that look like? And I was wondering how practical you wanted me to be in my answers, but something I have done with teams, with organizational teams in the not-for-profit world, is to spend time with people on surfacing these unconscious money stories. And one shape that can take, for example, that I really love is the Fintorn money game from Scotland, which is a game where people get together in a room and play together with real money. Like, they bring cash, and then there are interactions that take place with the cash. And for some people that might sound boring, for others that might sound terrifying, or it might sound really weird. But what it is, it's really rich and beautiful what happens in those games, and it puts people into very direct contact with their unconscious money stories. And then when you have a team together in a room, if there's sufficient level of honesty and safety in the room for people to talk to each other about these things, really beautiful things can happen in relationship with one another, and it can have a good impact on the relationships, for example, between these different parts of an organization that are in conflict over things like money and purpose.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I think that's an amazing entry point. The money game is very powerful in bringing up things you didn't even want to know about yourself.
Yes. From experience, absolutely true. Yes.
Agnes, and maybe the final thing for me to say is that I'm so delighted that you will be running the Conscious Use EU Money program starting the fall of 2023. And I couldn't feel that the program and the cohorts starting are in better hands than yours. So I'm very grateful that you're joining the team in this behalf.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited, and I have to still admit I feel like I'm feeling very big boots. But I'm also really excited and looking forward to it. Yeah.
Great. Agnes, thank you.
Thanks, Nadia.